There's a kind of pain that has no name, no obvious source, no clear moment when it began. You wake up one morning and you feel heavy, like someone placed stones in your chest while you were sleeping. You go through your day and everything is fine, objectively fine. Nothing terrible has happened, no crisis has arrived. But something inside you is screaming, and you don't know why. You search your recent memory for a cause, for something you can point to and say, "That's it, that's why I feel this way." But there's nothing there, just this nameless ache that follows you like a shadow. And the worst part, the part that makes it so unbearable, is that you start to believe the pain is your fault, that you're being dramatic, that you should just be grateful for what you have, that everyone else seems to be handling life just fine, so why can't you? But what if I told you that this unexplained hurt, this sourceless suffering, is actually your body and mind trying to tell you something crucial, something that our modern world has taught us to ignore, something that once understood could change everything about how you experience your life? Before we can understand why you're hurting, we need to understand something strange about how human consciousness works. Your brain is receiving approximately 11 million pieces of information every single second. 11 million! Every sight, every sound, every sensation on your skin, every internal signal from your organs, every chemical fluctuation in your bloodstream. It's all streaming into your nervous system in an overwhelming flood of data. But here's the thing. Your conscious mind can only process about 40 bits of information per second. 40 out of 11 million. That means that everything you're aware of, everything you think you're experiencing, is less than 1% of what's actually happening inside you and around you. Your brain is constantly filtering, constantly deciding what gets through to your conscious awareness and what gets shunted aside, processed in the background, tucked away in the basement of your mind where you don't have to think about it. And this filtering system, this bouncer at the door of your consciousness, it's making choices based on what it thinks you need to survive. Immediate threats get priority. That car coming toward you, that loud noise, that person who seems angry, these things punch through to your awareness instantly because your brain thinks they might kill you. But the subtle things, the slow-building things, the emotional undercurrents and unprocessed experiences and accumulated small wounds, these get filed away, dealt with later, or so your brain tells itself. Except later never really comes, because there's always something more urgent, always another immediate concern, always another reason to push the subtle pain down into the basement where you don't have to feel it consciously. And so it accumulates, day after day, year after year, this backlog of unprocessed emotion and unacknowledged hurt piling up in the darkness like water behind a dam, building pressure, waiting. Think about your typical day. You wake up to an alarm that jolts you from sleep, already starting your morning in a state of mild stress. You check your phone and see notifications, messages, news, demands on your attention before you've even fully woken up. You rush through breakfast or skip it entirely because there's no time. You commute through traffic or crowded public transport, your nervous system on alert, watching for threats, competing for space. You arrive at work or school and spend hours performing, managing how others perceive you, suppressing your authentic reactions, saying yes when you mean no, smiling when you feel nothing, pretending everything is fine because that's what's expected. You have a brief interaction with a colleague or family member that leaves you feeling slightly off, slightly dismissed or misunderstood, but it's not big enough to address, not important enough to make a fuss about, so you swallow it down and move on. You eat lunch at your desk or while scrolling through social media, not really tasting the food, not really resting, just refueling. You continue through the afternoon accumulating small frustrations, tiny disappointments, microscopic rejections, none of them significant enough to acknowledge, but all of them registering somewhere in your system. You finally finish your obligations, and instead of resting, you fill the evening with more stimulation, more screens, more noise, because silence feels uncomfortable now, because being alone with your thoughts feels dangerous. You fall into bed exhausted, sleep poorly because your nervous system is still activated, and wake up the next morning to do it all again. Now, where in that day did you process anything? Where did you give yourself space to feel what you were feeling, to acknowledge what was happening, to let your nervous system discharge the accumulated stress and emotion? Nowhere. It all just went into the basement. And this is one day. Multiply this by weeks, months, years, and you begin to understand why you might be hurting without knowing why. It's not that nothing happened, it's that 10,000 small things happened, and you never had the space or permission to feel any of them. So they're all still there, still unprocessed, still demanding attention in the only way they know how, through this nameless ache, through this sourceless pain, through this feeling that something is wrong, even when nothing seems obviously wrong. But there's another layer to this, something even more insidious. We live in a culture that has pathologized sadness, that treats emotional pain as a problem to be solved, rather than information to be understood. From the time we're children, we're taught to manage our emotions, to control ourselves, to not make a fuss, to be positive, to look on the bright side, to count our blessings. These messages come from parents who love us, from teachers who want to help, from a society that values productivity and pleasantness over authenticity and depth. And so we learn to distrust our own emotional experiences, to question whether what we're feeling is valid, to assume that if we're in pain, we must be doing something wrong. We learn that happiness is the default state we should return to, that anything else is a deviation requiring correction. We learn to ask, what's wrong with me, instead of what is this feeling trying to tell me? And here's where it gets really complicated, because sometimes the hurt you're feeling isn't even yours. You're carrying pain that was passed down to you, inherited trauma that lives in your body even though you never consciously experienced the original wound. Your grandmother who survived a famine, who learned that the world is dangerous and resources are scarce, who raised your parent with that fear woven into every interaction, who passed that fear to you through 10,000 subtle moments of anxiety around food, around money, around safety. Your parent who grew up feeling unseen, who learned that love is conditional, who unconsciously repeated that pattern with you, even while consciously trying to do better. Your ancestors who experienced violence, displacement, oppression, whose survival responses got encoded into your nervous system through mechanisms we're only beginning to understand. This is not metaphor, this is biology. Trauma actually changes gene expression, actually alters how your body responds to stress, actually gets transmitted across generations through what scientists call epigenetic inheritance. You might be hurting because you're carrying wounds that are decades or centuries old, pain that you did nothing to deserve, but that lives in your body nonetheless. Let's slow down here, because this is important. Imagine your nervous system as a house. The ground floor is your conscious awareness, where you live your daily life, where you have thoughts and make decisions and interact with the world. The basement is your unconscious, where everything else goes. All the unprocessed experiences, all the emotions you couldn't afford to feel at the time, all the survival responses that kicked in too fast for conscious thought. Now, under normal circumstances, you can go down into the basement occasionally, sort through what's there, process things at your own pace. But for many of us, the door to the basement is locked. We've been taught not to go down there, taught that what's in the basement is dangerous or shameful or overwhelming. So it just accumulates. And eventually, the basement gets so full that things start seeping up through the floorboards, manifesting as this unexplained pain, these sourceless feelings, the sense that something is wrong that you can't quite identify. And your body is trying to help, even though it doesn't feel like help. That heaviness in your chest, that's not random. That tightness in your throat, that fog in your mind, that exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix, these are signals, messages from the parts of you that are still carrying things you haven't fully processed. Your body is saying, hey, there's something down in the basement that needs attention. But because we've been taught to treat symptoms rather than investigate causes, we often respond by trying to make the signals go away. We push harder, work more, distract ourselves better, medicate the symptoms, force ourselves to be positive. And sometimes this works for a while. Sometimes we can keep the basement door sealed, but the pressure keeps building, and eventually something has to give. Here's a strange truth. Sometimes the hurt you're feeling is actually grief, but grief for things you never consciously knew you had. Grief for the childhood you deserved but didn't get, for the parents who could have met your needs but weren't capable, for the friendships that faded, for the versions of yourself you had to abandon to survive, for the dreams you had to release, for the innocence you lost so gradually you didn't notice until it was gone. This grief is complicated because there's no funeral for these losses, no ritual to mark their passing, no socially sanctioned space to mourn. You're expected to just move on, to be grateful for what you have, to focus on the positive. But the grief remains, unacknowledged, expressing itself as this vague ache, this sense of something missing that you can't quite name. And sometimes the pain you're feeling is actually anger that you never learned you were allowed to feel. Anger at the injustices you've experienced, at the times you were treated poorly, at the systems that exploit you, at the people who hurt you, at yourself for allowing things you couldn't actually prevent. But anger is dangerous, or so we're taught. Anger is destructive. Anger is ugly. Anger means you're not spiritual enough, not evolved enough, not mature enough. So you push it down, transform it into something more acceptable, and it emerges as depression, as anxiety, as this free-floating sense of wrongness that has no clear target because you've learned that having a target, naming what makes you angry, is not allowed. Let me tell you about a concept from psychology called normative dissociation. It's the idea that in order to function in modern society, most of us have to dissociate from large parts of our experience, have to split off aspects of ourselves that don't fit the roles we're required to play. You learn to separate from your body's needs because work demands don't allow for rest when you're tired or eating when you're hungry. You learn to separate from your authentic emotions because social conventions require you to be pleasant even when you feel terrible. You learn to separate from your deeper knowing because the world tells you to ignore your intuition and trust external authorities instead. And this dissociation, this splitting, it's so common that we consider it normal, consider it just part of being an adult, part of being responsible. But normal doesn't mean healthy, and the cost of this constant self-fragmentation is this persistent sense of being disconnected, not quite fully here, like you're watching your life through glass. The irony is that the pain you can't explain is actually truthful than the stories you tell yourself about being fine. Your conscious mind is incredibly skilled at rationalization, at explaining away, at finding reasons to keep going even when everything in you wants to stop. But your body doesn't lie. Your body keeps the score, as the saying goes. Those headaches that have no medical cause, that exhaustion that seems disproportionate to your activity level, that digestive distress that comes and goes mysteriously, these aren't random. These are your body's way of insisting that you pay attention, that you stop ignoring what's really happening, that you acknowledge the gap between how you're living and what you actually need. And here's something that might surprise you. Sometimes you're hurting because you're not hurting enough. Stay with me here. What I mean is that you've become so skilled at numbing, at distracting, at keeping yourself busy and stimulated and entertained that you're not allowing yourself to feel the full weight of what you're carrying. The pain that's seeping through is just the tip of the iceberg, the small amount that manages to break through your defenses. And your system knows that if you really let yourself feel it all at once, it would be overwhelming, possibly unbearable. So it meters it out, gives you these manageable doses of nameless ache, these moments when the numbness wears thin and you get a glimpse of what's really there. And even these glimpses feel like too much, make you want to run back to the distractions, back to the busyness, back to anything that will make the feeling stop. But what if the feeling isn't the problem? What if the feeling is actually the beginning of the solution? What if this unexplained hurt is your psyche's way of trying to heal, of bringing to the surface what needs to be acknowledged and processed and released? What if instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" you asked, "What is trying to emerge?" What if instead of trying to make the pain go away, you got curious about what it's trying to tell you? This is not about wallowing, not about getting stuck in suffering, but about recognizing that emotions are information, that pain is a messenger, that sometimes the only way out is through. Let me be clear about something. I'm not suggesting that all pain is psychological, that everything can be solved through emotional processing, that you should ignore medical symptoms or avoid seeking professional help. Sometimes you're hurting because something is physically wrong and you need medical attention. Sometimes you're hurting because you have a clinical mental health condition that requires treatment. Sometimes you're hurting because your circumstances are genuinely harmful and you need to change your situation, not your perspective. What I'm talking about is that specific kind of hurt that has no clear physical cause, no obvious external trigger, that nameless ache that your doctor can't find a reason for, that comes and goes mysteriously, that feels like it's emanating from somewhere deeper than your current circumstances. So what do you do with this pain? How do you begin to understand it, to work with it, to allow it to teach you what it's trying to teach you? The first step, paradoxically, is to stop trying to make it go away. Stop treating it as an enemy to be defeated, a problem to be solved, a weakness to be overcome. Start treating it as information, as a visitor bringing news from the parts of yourself you've been ignoring. This doesn't mean indulging in suffering, not making it your identity, but it does mean giving it space, acknowledging it, being willing to sit with discomfort instead of immediately reaching for relief. The second step is to create space for feeling, not just thinking about feelings, not just analyzing them or trying to understand them intellectually, but actually feeling them in your body. That tightness in your chest, where exactly is it? What's its quality, its texture? If it had a color, what would it be? If it had something to say, what would it tell you? Not analyzing, not explaining, just being with it, breathing with it, allowing it to exist without trying to change it. The third step is to understand that healing is not linear. You won't process all your unacknowledged pain in one session of sitting with your feelings. You won't wake up one day suddenly free of this nameless ache. Healing happens in layers, in spirals, in waves. You'll have periods where you feel like you're making progress, followed by periods where the pain comes back stronger than ever. This doesn't mean you're failing or doing it wrong. This means you're going deeper, reaching older wounds, accessing parts of yourself that have been locked away longer. The pain that surfaces is not new pain, it's old pain finally getting the attention it needed all along. And here's something crucial that almost no one talks about. Sometimes you need to grieve for the time you lost to not knowing why you were hurting. You need to acknowledge the years you spent thinking something was wrong with you, the energy you wasted trying to fix yourself when you weren't actually broken, the opportunities you missed because you were carrying so much unprocessed pain that you couldn't fully show up for your life. This grief is valid. This grief deserves space, and paradoxically, allowing yourself to grieve the cost of your suffering often helps to release some of that suffering. There's also this: the pain might never fully go away, and that's okay. The goal is not to achieve some permanent state of happiness or peace where you never hurt again. The goal is to develop a different relationship with your pain, to see it as part of the full spectrum of human experience, rather than as evidence that something is wrong with you. The goal is to be able to hurt and know why, to trace the feeling back to its source, to understand what it's telling you about your needs and boundaries and values. The goal is to stop hurting in silence, stop pretending you're fine when you're not, stop believing you're alone in this experience that is actually deeply, profoundly universal. Because here's the truth that no one wants to say out loud. Everyone is hurting in ways they don't fully understand. Everyone is carrying unprocessed pain, inherited trauma, accumulated small wounds. The person who seems to have it all together, they're hurting. The person who's always positive and upbeat, they're hurting. The person who seems invulnerable, who never shows weakness, they're especially hurting because they've learned they're not allowed to acknowledge it. We're all walking around with basements full of unfelt feelings, all trying to keep the door locked, all occasionally getting overwhelmed when something seeps through the floorboards. The difference is just in how much we're willing to acknowledge it, how much we're willing to let others see it, how much we're willing to extend compassion to ourselves for being human, for being imperfect, for carrying more than we can sometimes bear. And maybe that's the real answer to why you're hurting without knowing why. Maybe it's not about finding one specific cause, one clear explanation, one thing you can point to and say, that's it. Maybe it's about recognizing that you're a human being living in a world that asks too much and gives too little, that pushes you to produce without space to rest, that demands you be happy without providing the conditions for genuine well-being, that tells you to be yourself while punishing you for any authentic expression that doesn't fit acceptable norms. Maybe the pain is not a sign that something is wrong with you, but a sign that something is wrong with how we're living, with the pace we're keeping, with the disconnection we're accepting as normal, with the way we've learned to abandon ourselves in order to fit in, to be accepted, to survive. So if you're hurting and don't know why, I want you to know something. You're not broken. You're not weak. You're not doing it wrong. You're human, beautifully, messily, painfully human. And that nameless ache you're feeling, it's not your enemy, it's your ally. It's trying to guide you back to yourself, back to the parts of you that got left behind, back to a way of living that's more aligned with who you actually are and what you actually need. The hurt is not the problem. The hurt is the doorway, and on the other side is a deeper relationship with yourself, a more honest understanding of your experience, a more compassionate approach to being alive. The question is not, how do I make this stop? The question is, what is this trying to show me? And sometimes the answer to that question changes everything.